Okay, good morning everyone. Today's daf is Tzadi Hey, but we're going to start with Tzadi Dalit Amud Bet at the bottom. We're going to start 3 or 4 lines up from the bottom. We're not going to go all the way back to the Mishnah because it's a little bit too much to try to squeeze in for one day. So we're going to have to take for granted what went before. The Mishnah talked about a couple of grooming practices, which there's a machloket, whether they are asurim mideoraita or midrabanan, whether they are biblically or rabbinically prohibited. And included in this was biting off your nails and removing hair with your hands from your body, and hagodelet, hakochelet, v'hapokeset, which we're going to interpret. Godelet is braiding the hair. Kochelet is applying some kind of a makeup to the face. And pokeset, Rashi brings 2 explanations. The easier of the 2 to understand is that it also has something to do with primping the hair in some way. The harder one to understand, to fit with the ensuing discussion, would be that it means to apply like a rouge to the face. Rashi brings both of these interpretations. It's easier to take the first one, that it has to do with hair, as we're going to see. So the Gemara says, Godelet, kochelet, upokeset, mishumai mechayeva. What is the reason? In other words, it's easy to say something's prohibited, but you have to show which melacha, which heading of the 39 melachot are these practices prohibited under. Okay? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Avin, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Hanina. So Rabbi Avin said that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Hanina said, Godelet mishum oreget. What is the reason why you can't braid your hair? I wouldn't know about this, but what's the reason why you can't braid your hair? It's weaving. It's like weaving. And kochelet mishum kotevet. What is the problem with applying eye makeup like mascara? It's like writing. And pokeset mishum toveh. And what is the reason why you can't primp your hair in this way? Because it's like making threads. Toveh is making threads out of the raw material, out of the shearing of the sheep. They would make thread out of it. And so too, if the woman is combing her hair in such a way as to de-knot it, or whatever it is, whatever pokeset means, it's similar to making individual threads out of, let's say you have a lump of cotton or wool or whatever, and you're combing out the threads to make threads. So this is what it comes under. So according to Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, this would be asur mideoraita. This would be biblically prohibited because of these 3 melachot, and according to the Chachamim, rabbinically prohibited. But amaru rabbanan kamed Rabbi Abahu. So the rabbis, the students, said this in front of Rabbi Abahu. They reported this interpretation that the 3 melachot that are being violated here are weaving, writing, and making threads. And what did he say? V'chiderech ariga bekach, v'chiderech ketiva bekach, v'chiderech tivia bekach. How could these be the accurate explanations? I mean, is weaving normally done with something connected to the head? Not really. Is writing normally done just by blotching black ink on the face? No. Is really making threads made just by untangling? No, it's not so simple. It's not so simple. So this is not the normal way of doing any of these melachot. Okay, and so therefore this can't really be the right explanation. Therefore he says, Amar Rabbi Abahu, rather Rabbi Abahu said, L'didi mefarshali minei Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina. I don't have to speculate what the reason is for these prohibitions. I got it from the source. Okay, he got it from Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina directly. That wasn't what he said. He didn't say that was the explanation. He said as follows: Kochelet bishum tzova'at. Dying is a melacha, not dying D-Y-I-N-G. Dying is not something under your control, although killing somebody would be a melacha. But it would be shechita. But that's how it's talking, or nitilat neshama. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about dying D-Y-E. Okay, coloring something is one of the melachot. Obviously, putting color into something. That's why you can't put on mascara. Godelet upokeset mishum bona. And what's the problem with either braiding the hair or otherwise primping the hair and so on? It's considered a type of building. Okay, now that sounds odd to you, I know at first, but we're going to see why. So the Gemara asks, "V'chiderech binyan bekach," is doing your hair really considered building? And now you find out that all of the hairdressers are actually construction workers. So now it actually turns out, right? So he says, yes. Darash Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, because Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says a very famous drasha, which is brought in Rashi on Chumash, Vayiven Hashem Elohim et hatzela, that it says that Hashem took the rib of the man or the side piece from Adam and made it into the woman, and it says Vayiven, he built it into the woman. So what's Vayiven? Melamed shekile'ah hakadosh baruch hu lechava ve'evia etzel Adam. It means that he not only made Chava, he didn't just make Eve, but he actually primped her. He did her hair. Hashem was the first hairdresser. So anybody who thinks that that's not a respectable profession, obviously it's very respectable, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the first hairdresser. He did a perm and everything. He braided her hair and brought her to Adam. So that's binyan, vayiven. It's building. So therefore, braiding hair comes under binyan. Of course, the rabbis say, the Chachamim say, this is only midrabanan. Sheken bekrachei hayam. Korin lekal'ita banita, because in some of the seaside towns, and oftentimes the Gemara will bring slang that is heard by sailors would go to different cities, and they would hear slang that was used. They would call a girl who had her hair all braided banita, a built-up girl. So that meant that it was perceived as a type of building. Now again, according to the rabbis, this isur of binyan is midirabanan. It's only rabbinic. It's not literally an isur deoraita, a biblical prohibition of binyan, but it's only rabbinic. Yeah.
When you go to all those islands and these on the beach, you have ladies that dress
Right.
children.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that that's what he says here. I mean, Shekilah Kadosh Baruch Hu, he translates even to. He doesn't
Kil'ah,
talk,
right? He braided.
Talk about hair here.
Kil'ah means to braid the hair. It means braiding the hair.
I'm not reading it that way at all.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's how they're understanding it. I hear what you could interpret it differently, but otherwise you're going to have to say that you're going to have to interpret kil'ah in a different way than it's normally used, so it would be unusual. But anyway, Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Godelet, kochelet, upokeset la'atzma, peturah. Even according to the one who holds that it's biblically prohibited to do your hair or to put on your makeup on Shabbat, lachaverta chayevet. Really, if you do it for yourself, since you can't really do a good job doing your own hair, therefore it's not going to be biblically a biblical violation, and you can't do your own makeup perfectly. Although this is talking obviously in a time where they didn't have mirrors. Right? And now we have mirrors easily accessible. I would say that probably doing your own makeup is possible. Doing your own hair still would be quite difficult, if not impossible, at least to do it well. However, if you do it for somebody else, you do somebody else's makeup, you go to the mall and the ladies there, they do your makeup and you do that. So that would be biblically prohibited. Or if someone does your hair, that would be biblically prohibited, because obviously the prohibition is the person doing the hair, not the person who's getting their hair done. Because then it can be done in a most excellent way.
But the problem is that doesn't answer the difficulty that they're raising, that it cannot be something that, because it's done with a shinui. It's not a regular way of writing.
Why is it a shinui? Because they got rid of writing. Now they're saying it's not writing that's the problem, it is dyeing. So dyeing and coloring, it's not a shinui.
So the way they answered it is basically they said, well, it's not. It's a different category of halacha that.
Right. It seems like the reason why it's only rabbinic, according to the rabbis in all these cases, is because the effect is only temporary. So whereas dyeing normally is meant to be permanent, putting on makeup is not meant to be permanent, and that's why the rabbis apparently are saying that it's only rabbinical. Or when you do your hair, when you braid hair, it's not meant to be permanently braided. So it's not the same as binyan, which is intended to be a permanent, lasting type of thing. So, but really, otherwise it would qualify because you're creating a structure out of parts. No, because it's asur midrabanan, because it's similar to building. So they're saying it's similar. Yeah, that's what they're saying. So he says that if you do it for yourself, the braiding of the hair, you can't do it as well. So it's not really considered even to according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds it's biblically prohibited. He would still say you're exempt and you're only liable when you're doing somebody else's hair, because then you can do it really well. Okay, so v'chein haya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer mishum Rabbi Eliezer, and so did Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar say in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that normally if you braid hair, in other words, if you braid hair, it could be a biblical prohibition. He's saying in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Isha lo ta'avir sarak al panea mipnei shetzovat, that a woman should not put any kind of makeup on her face because it's considered coloring. It's considered like under the melacha of dyeing. Now, normally the melacha of dyeing is something which is applied to, not to your face, but is really applied only to cloth or material. And here it's only a temporary dyeing, but still, he would say that one should not do it because of that. And apparently, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's biblically prohibited. According to the Chachamim, it's only rabbinically prohibited because it's temporary. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. HaCholev v'hamechabetz v'hamegaven kegrogeret. So if somebody is hacholev, if you milk a cow on Shabbat, hamechabetz, mechabetz, Rashi gives two possible meanings. One possibility is it means putting milk into the stomach of the animal. This is what they used to do is they would take the stomach of the animal and they would put the milk in a dead animal, obviously, and they would put the milk in the stomach because the stomach had enzymes that would cause the cheese to curdle. So that's one interpretation, but Rashi prefers a different interpretation, which what it means is taking milk and putting it in basically like a basket that would filter. It was like a filter. It would filter out the liquid and keep just the chunky parts of the milk. Okay, and that makes more sense with the ensuing Gemara too. And hamigaven, and somebody who makes cheese on Shabbat. So all of these things are prohibited. If you make grogeret, if you make a fig's volume worth of any of these things, all of these, if you milk a fig's worth of milk out of the cow, if you filter a fig's worth of this curd or whatever from the milk, if you make a fig's worth of cheese, all of these things are prohibited. Hamechabed, somebody who sweeps the floor. V'amirabetz, if somebody puts water, they would sprinkle water on the floor to hold the dust, because otherwise the dust would rise into the air. So on a day where dust was rising, they would wet the floor. V'harodeh halot devash, or somebody who removes the combs of honey from the beehive. Shagag b'Shabbat chayav. If he did it by accident on Shabbat, he has to bring a korban chatat. Chayav chatat. Hezid b'Yom Tov. If he did it on purpose on Yom Tov, loke arba'im. Then he is whipped 40 times. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. In other words, what that means is Rabbi Eliezer says that these three things are biblically prohibited. So on Yom Tov, the worst you can get on Yom Tov is whipping, and you only are punished on Yom Tov if you violate it on purpose. On Shabbat, there are gradations. If you did it on purpose, it's chayav skila. It could be death penalty. If you do it by accident on Shabbat, it's chayav chatat. You only have to bring a chatat. So that's why he's mentioning Yom Tov and Shabbat. Now, according to Rashi, this is only referring to the last three items. The first three items, everybody agrees, are prohibited. The milking a cow, and making the cheese, or sifting, filtering the milk, all of these things are deoraita, according to everybody, it would seem. These last three cases of sweeping the floor, wetting the floor to hold the dust, and removing the honeycombs from the bees, from the beehive, these are where you have a machloket with Rabbi Eliezer saying that it's biblically prohibited. All of these things are only because of a rabbinic prohibition. Now, there are two different ways. Some people translate this as shevot. Some people translate it, pronounce it as shevut. The Steinsaltz has it as shevut. The grammatically correct way would seem to be shevot, because it comes from the word tishbot. But it doesn't really matter that much. Rav Nachman bar Gurya Rav Nachman bar Gurya came to Nahar Da'a. Ba'umine, they asked him the following question: Cholev mishumay mechayev. What is the reason why you cannot milk a cow on Shabbat? And what did he say? Amar lahu mishum cholev. He said, because you're milking. Now, obviously, he's not really giving them an answer, is he? Because they were asking, which melacha does it come under? And he's not answering them. What are you violating when you sift or when you filter the milk to save the curd? What are you violating? He said, because you're filtering. He's not giving them an answer. What is the reason why you can't make cheese on Shabbat? What did he say? He said, because you're making cheese. So is he giving them an answer? No. Amrulei, they said in the Beit Midrash, Rabach katil kane be'agmahava. Your teacher is like a reed cutter in the swamp, meaning he doesn't know anything, this guy. We're not impressed, because we ask him a question and he doesn't give an answer. We wanted to know which melacha each of these prohibitions is a violation of, and he doesn't tell us. Okay, he does not explain. Atashil Beit Midrash, so they came to the Beit Midrash and asked the question. Amrulei, they said the following answer, Cholev chayav mishum mifarek. Milking a cow, the violation is because of mifarek, which is dash, meaning you're extracting something from its source. So just like you can't, for example, squeeze grapes to produce juice on Shabbat, you can't squeeze olives to extract oil on Shabbat, you cannot remove the grain from the husk on Shabbat. This is called dash. So similarly, you cannot remove milk from the udder, its natural home, on Shabbat. Mechavetz chayav mishum borer, the filtering of the milk to get the curd and to allow the milk, the liquid parts to spill out, is borer. It's selecting. Megaven chayav mishum boneh, and why can't you make cheese? Because of boneh, because you're building. Because you're making a structure, you're taking these different elements. It's a tolada, of course. It's a derivative of the malacha of boneh, but you're making a structure out of the pieces, so to speak, that are solidify into cheese. So now we get to the latter three cases where there's a machloket between Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. And by the way, there's lots of discussion in contemporary situations about milking cows, and what about when it causes pain to the cow? What do you do then with these dairy cows that are given? Unfortunately, they're treated in such a way as to cause them to produce a lot of milk, and then it's very uncomfortable for them. So they have ways of milking them to alleviate the pain
we milk by machines.
Right, they milk by machines, but they put them on timers. Yeah, they put them on timers, or so the problem is to milk. Right. So the problem is that saving the milk is the problem. Or like if a woman is breastfeeding and she needs to pump and collect the milk on Shabbat, it's their problem. What?
Sure. We used to milk, and you don't throw anything.
Right, but the problem is that, it's a problem. When you do it, when you set it up from beforehand on Shabbat and the timer goes, they have ways of getting around it. But to actually go and milk the cow on Shabbat and to take the milk is a malacha on Shabbat. It's dash. It's just like squeezing a grape to make juice. Huh? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Just like you can't squeeze out grapes on Shabbat. Drink it right away, can you?
You could squeeze lemon on.
That's a different story, and then you can only do it onto a salad. You can't do it but that's another thing. Okay, so let's not get too far. So the last three cases of sweeping the floor, wetting the floor to hold the dust down, and removing the honeycombs from the beehive, all these three things. Shagag b'Shabbat chayav chatat. Hezid b'yom tov lo ke'arba'im ad divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer says these are biblical violations. Therefore, on Shabbat one would be chayav chatat if he did it by accident. And what is the reason? Amar Rabbi Elazar. This is not Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is a Tana. He appears in the Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar is an Amorah, explaining someone who has a name very similar but not identical to his. Because Eliezer is not the same as Elazar. Elazar is the son of Aharon HaKohen. Eliezer is the Eved Avraham. They're different people. Even in the Chumash, they're different people. Here, they're definitely different people. Rabbi Eliezer is in the Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar sounds similar, but he's really an Amorah. Okay? He could be a Rabbi too, because there are some early Amoraim that also are Rabbi. Yeah. Right, Elazar. He's Elazar. But this is not necessarily. I don't think this is him though. I think this is Rabbi Elazar, the later one.
Elazar ben Azariah?
Yeah. So right. So my Tamad Rabbi Eliezer. What's the reason of Rabbi Eliezer? Because it says in the Tanakh when it talks about the story of Shaul and Yonatan. They're pursuing the Pelishtim, and Shaul adjures everyone. I believe is the fancy word for it. He makes everyone swear that they're not going to partake of any food or drink that day, as long as they're chasing down the Pelishtim. And Yonatan, who was doing an unauthorized spying mission on the other side, returns to the group and didn't hear this. So when they're traveling in the forest and he sees a Ya'arat Dvash, he sees literally a forest of honey is what it means, but the Mefarshim explain in Sefer Shmuel that what it means is like a trail of honey, that was on. So he takes his staff and he takes some of it and he tastes it and he feels good, and everyone criticizes him. How can you violate the king's order? You're not supposed to. Whatever. It's another story. But the point is, why is it called Ya'arat Devash? Why is it called a forest of honey instead of a stream of honey? V'chima inyan Ya'ar etzel Devash. Why is it called a forest of honey? Ela lomar lecha, to tell you, Ma Ya'arat olesh mimenu b'Shabbat chayav chatat. Just like the forest forest, if you pluck something out of a forest, chayav chatat, you violated Shabbat biblically, af chalot devash, so too honey. Harodeh mimenu b'Shabbat, chayav chatat. If you remove a honeycomb from the beehive on Shabbat, chayav chatat. So in other words, it's considered just like something planted in the ground. Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana, is comparing the forest that has plants that are rooted in the ground, and therefore you can't pull them out, to a beehive that has honeycomb rooted in it. So just like you can't extract something, so to speak, you can't uproot something in a forest, you can't uproot the honeycomb from the beehive. And the rabbis would say that's just a drash. That's just a drasha. That's not literal. We can't make a literal halacha from that. It's just a remez, maybe a hint, but it's not literal, and therefore they're not going to take that as a biblically equating removing honeycombs to pulling something out of the ground. But Rabbi Eliezer is taking it literally, that this equation means that it's equivalent to pulling it out of the ground. Amemar sharaz zilcha b'machuzah. It says that Amemar allowed in Machozah, which was his city, he allowed people to pour water on the ground to hold the dust down on Shabbat, even though we just read that you're not allowed to do that. So Rashi explains the Rabbetz Abayit, because v'ritzpat avanim hayta b'chol ha'ir, because everyone in Machozah had a stone floor. They were wealthier. Okay, in most places, the poorer places, they had dirt floor. So basically, when you would put water on the ground, what you're causing the ground to become flatter. You're evening out the ground by putting water on it, and that was the malacha of evening out the ground. You're not allowed to do that. Okay? In Machozah, where people were wealthier, they had stone floors, so pouring water on the ground, you're not doing anything. So Amemar allowed it.
Which malacha is evening out the ground?
Which malacha is evening out the ground? It could be building. Yeah.
But you really don't even the ground. You just.
But it could be. Right.
You don't even.
That's why the Chachamim say it's only Asur Midrabanan, because they say it's only similar to that, but it's not really that you're definitely going to be evening out the ground necessarily. Amar Tama Mai Amur Rabbanan. What did the rabbis say was the reason why you can't do this? Ashvuye gumot, because you're going to flatten out spaces. Hacha leka gumot. But now we don't have floors that have holes in them like this of dust, because we have in Machozah, we're wealthier, we have stone floors. You can pour water all day long, and you're not going to make any changes in the floor, so therefore it's not going to be an issue of binyan, of building, or of improving the ground in any way. Rava tosfa'a ashkechel Ravina dekam mitzta'ir mehavla. So Ravina saw that, Ravatos, I think it should be Rabbah actually, right? Yeah. Rabbatos fa'asa Ravina was very upset because the air was very dusty in his house, because I guess it was a windy day, whatever, and there was dust in the house, and he was really upset. Amrela, and some say Mar Kashisha, Berei de Rava Ashkechel Ravashi to come mehavla. Some say that it was two different characters. It was Mar Kashisha, the son of Rava, who found Rav Ashi, who was upset about the dusty air. Amar Le, whoever it was, said to the person who was upset, Lo savar lamar lahaditanya, didn't you learn what we learned in a Baraita? That Harotzeh lirabetet beto b'Shabbat. True, the rabbi said that you're not allowed to water your ground on Shabbat because you might flatten out holes. But still, there's a way to get around it, which is mevi areva malei mayim v'rochetz panav bezavit zo, yadav bezavit zo, raglav bezavit zo, v'nimtza habayit mitrabetz me'elav. Very, very simple. Bring a trough full of water. Wash your hands in one corner of the house, wash your face in another corner of the house, wash the dishes in the third corner. The water is going all over, sloughing all over. And what happens? By accident, you end up. It's called ha'arama. You're allowed to do subterfuge when it comes to rabbinic. It's only a rabbinic prohibition, so you can get around it by in a backhanded way. So you wash your hands, you wash your face, do whatever, and the water ends up falling on the ground and causing the dust to settle of its own accord. Amar Le, he said to him, Lav adatai, I didn't remember that halacha. I forgot it. That's what Rashi says. He says some say that it means I don't hold by it. Right, I don't like that kind of trickster.
My opinion.
Right, it's not. It doesn't mean. It either means that's not my opinion, or I forgot about that halacha. Either way, Tana. It says in another Tosefta, Isha Chachama, a smart woman, which interestingly Rashi defines as Eshet Talmid Chacham, which reflects, I think, his era. The only person who could be a smart woman would be someone whose husband was smart back then. Because Eshet Talmid Chacham or Bat Talmid Chacham. Now, this is not very politically correct, and certainly would not be applicable to nowadays, where many women are quite well versed in halacha and self-educated, educated independently, and they've studied much Torah and halacha. But and he's taught his daughters, right? So, but maybe even he realized that back then it was different. I don't know. Anyway, Isha Chachma mirabetzet beta b'Shabbat, that a wise woman can figure out a way to wet the ground of her house on Shabbat, which means to say that she can do one of these subterfuge methods of indirectly causing the water to fall on the ground so that it will cause the dust to settle without directly doing it. However, the Gemara ends off by saying, but nowadays, this viralan karebi Shimon sharei afilu lechatchila, actually nowadays, we don't hold by this halacha at all. Why not? Because we accepted, remember, there's an ongoing machloket, raging machloket throughout Masekhet Shabbat between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Is davar she'eno mitkaven prohibited? If you don't intend for something, is it prohibited or not? And at a certain period of time, apparently Rabbi Yehuda's view was the dominant one. So since Rabbi Yehuda's view was the dominant one, everybody agrees when you wash your hands, when you wet the ground, you're doing it for the purpose of the dust settling. You're not doing it for the purpose of evening out holes in the ground, and even if you did, it wouldn't be an inevitable result. But remember that Rabbi Yehuda holds that even if it's not inevitable, and even if it's unintentional, you can't do an action that by its nature leads to a prohibited result if it's a typical result, even if it's not inevitable. Rabbi Shimon agrees when it's inevitable that you can't do it. If it were inevitable, everyone would agree you can't do it. If it's not inevitable, but it's within the normal range of possibility, Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do that action because it's within the normal range of possibility that it's going to cause the ground to become flatter. Okay, so that was, and the machloket in the Mishnah was according to Rabbi Yehuda's view. Rabbi Eliezer was saying that, the machloket in the Braita was according to Rabbi Yehuda's view. That Rabbi Eliezer was saying that I hold that it's actually inevitable, so therefore it's actually biblically prohibited. And the Chachamim were saying it's not biblically prohibited because it's not inevitable, but it's at least rabbinically prohibited according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though you don't intend for it, because it's likely to flatten out the ground.
At the very least, it'll be with the shinui, because it will.
Even without the shinui,
no,
okay? That shinui was necessary.
If you're washing it, there is water.
No, that's something else. That's something else. In other words, doing it directly was prohibited biblically according to Rabbi Eliezer and rabbinically according to the Chachamim. Okay? Well, hold on. Forget that. Forget the subterfuge for a second. Forget that. We're going a step back now. Okay? We're talking about just directly doing it.
Okay.
So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the machloket in the Braita is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that davar she'eno mitkaven is not allowed. Even though you don't intend to flatten out the ground, it's still prohibited rabbinically. Rabbi Eliezer says, actually it's prohibited biblically because I hold that it's inevitable. The Chachamim say, no, it's not inevitable, but you can't do it because Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do something which is in its nature to cause a prohibited result, even though it's not your intention. Okay, wait. So according to that view, they were saying then you have to do subterfuge, because the rabbis are holding like Rabbi Yehuda that to do it directly would be prohibited. So we need to do it indirectly for subterfuge. But Rabbi Shimon would hold you don't even need subterfuge, because according to Rabbi Shimon, you're allowed to do something where the result is not inevitable. You're allowed to do it directly.
But even before answering that,
right.
What does Rabbi Yehuda mean when he says davar she'eno mitkaven?
Thing that you don't intend.
Okay, so if it's something you don't intend, right? Something you don't intend, in other words, you're either doing it.
You're putting the water to settle the dust. That's why.
Right, but you're not. If you're not intending it, then you're either you were walking and you didn't realize that there was water that was coming out, or you're consciously doing something else that causes that.
Right. Well, no. Rabbi Yehuda prohibits doing an activity where there's a likelihood, it's rabbinical, but he prohibits you doing an activity where there's a likelihood that a prohibited result will happen. Rabbi Shimon says if it's only a likelihood, you can still do it.
He's evaluating the risk that it takes.
Exactly. If there's a significant risk of a prohibited thing, you're not allowed to do it.
But,
even if your intention is different. So in this case, let's say, throwing the water on the ground, we know what your intention is. Your intention is to dust to settle. So Rabbi Yehuda would say, wait a second, it's rabbinically prohibited, because even though your intention is for the dust to settle, it's very likely that you're going to even out the ground. Rabbi Shimon would say, who cares if it's very likely? If it's not inevitable, I don't care. And that's why the Gemara ends off by saying, nowadays we hold like Rabbi Shimon's position. If it's not inevitable, we don't care. So therefore, one could sprinkle water even directly. You wouldn't have to do the subterfuge anymore, because even directly you could pour the water on the ground. Now, it happens to be that nowadays we have an even better reason why we're allowed to sweep our floors on Shabbat, which is nobody has a dirt floor, at least nobody that I know. So therefore, this wouldn't apply to us at all. That's why we can sweep and do all those things and use our Swiffer.
So according to Rabbi Yehuda, if it's inevitable and you do it anyway, you're chayav skila.
Everybody agrees that if it's inevitable and you do it anyway, it's deoraita. Right? Yeah. You would be. It would be. So now the new Mishnah, hatolesh me'atzitz nakuv. Atzitz nakuv is a favorite subject of the Talmud. It comes up in many different contexts. Atzitz nakuv means a potted plant that has a hole in it. Okay, like sometimes they have that, right? Ground, yeah. So it doesn't actually halachically. It doesn't have to be in the bottom. We're going to see, but let's say that let's assume that. But if there's a hole, so atzitz nakuv means it has a hole. So if a person is tolesh me'atzitz nakuv, so what you have is you have a plant growing in this pot. This pot is sitting on the ground. Now everybody knows if you have a plant growing out of the ground, then you pluck it out on Shabbat. Obviously, that's called tolesh. For sure, you're not allowed to do that. That's kotzer. It's actually under the melacha of kotzer, but that's just a technicality, which is reaping. Now, what if you have an atzitz nakuv? So an atzitz nakuv, generally, we treat it as if it were planted in the ground, because there's a hole in the pot is on the ground, so we treat it like the pot is planted in the ground. However, v'she'eno nakuv patur. If it doesn't have a hole in it, the pot doesn't have a hole in it, so then patur. If you pluck something out of that, you're not really plucking it out of the ground. It's planted in a pot. It's not planted in the ground. V'Rabbi Shimon poter bazeh uvazeh. But Rabbi Shimon, now again, when it says patur, what does it mean in Hilchot Shabbat? You're not allowed to, but you didn't violate the biblical prohibition. Rabbi Shimon says, you know what? Even in atzitz nakuv, I hold it's no problem. Not that it's no problem, it's only rabbinically prohibited. Anything in a pot, even if the pot has a hole in it, if it's not directly attached to the ground, it's not considered planted. That's what Rabbi Shimon says. The Gemara says, Ramile Abaye l'Rava. Abaye raised the following contradiction to Rava. Va'amrela Rabbi Chia barav l'Rav. And some say it was Rabbi Chia, the son of Rav, raising it to his father Rav. Tenan, we learned in this Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon poter bazeh uvazeh alma nakuv l'Rabbi Shimon kishe'eno nakuv mashvele. In our Mishnah, it sounds like Rabbi Shimon maintains that there's absolutely no difference between a pot that has a hole in it and a pot that doesn't have a hole in it. And we would generalize and say, okay, so if that's true, then in all cases we would assume the same result, right? If Rabbi Shimon holds in Hilchot Shabbat that a potted plant, a plant in a pot that has a hole in it is considered just as the same as a pot that doesn't have a hole in it, so that should apply to all halachot, not just Hilchot Shabbat. Uraminu, but we raise the following objection: Rabbi Shimon Omer in ben nakuv l'sheino nakuv, that there's no difference between a pot with a hole in it and a pot without a hole in it. Ela lahachshir zera'im bilvad. There is, in fact, a difference. What is the difference? Well, we know that there's such a concept as hechsher tum'ah that we've come across many times so far in the daf, and much of it was in the first and second perakim of this Masechet, but elsewhere too. That in order for something to become tameh, in order for a food to be capable, to be receptive of tumah, it must have gotten wet. Now, obviously, it must have gotten wet after it was detached from the ground. Why? Because if we were to apply that rule even while it was attached to the ground, it would be nonsensical. Because every item attached to the ground was rained on at some time. Otherwise, it wouldn't have grown. And so the idea wouldn't make any sense. So what it means is once it's detached from the ground, it's like you have matzah shemura, it's shemura mishat kitzira. If you said that water couldn't touch the grain while it was still planted in the ground, you wouldn't have any grain.
That's not proof, because rain, it has to be with the kiyutan, has to be with your kavana.
Right, of course. No, I'm just saying.
Not with kavana,
Right, of course, but actually, yeah, but it is b'chiyutan. That's not true, because if a person takes, let's say, if a person takes grain that's already been detached from the ground and wants the water to fall on it, even if it's rainwater, it would be b'chiyutan because he wants it. So in the case of grain that's planted, you would apply b'chiyutan. That's the principle that the water has to be something you want. We came across that too in the Masekhet a while ago, but that general principle would apply to rainwater. It's not that the water has to be from your hand. It's just that you have to want it. So in this case, you want the rain to fall on the grain when it's planted in the ground because you want it to grow. So once you remove it from the ground, so seeds that become wet when they're removed from the ground are now capable of being mikabel tuma. But Rabbi Shimon says if they are planted in a pot, they're not, and water goes on the seeds planted in a pot, they can't become tameh still. They're still impervious to tuma until you uproot them from the pot. So wait a second, that's a contradiction. Because in Hilchot Shabbat, you're telling me that a plant that's in a pot, whether it has a hole or not, is not considered attached to the ground. It's considered detached already. So it should also then be considered detached with respect to tum'ah, and therefore if water touches it, it should now be receptive to impurity. So what does he answer him? Amar Lei said to him, L'chol milei Rabbi Shimon katalush mashveleh. In all respects, Rabbi Shimon considers a plant that's in a pot, whether it has a hole or not, to be detached. V'shaneh le'inyan tum'ah, da'hatorah ribita ta'orah etzel zira'im. But there's a difference when it comes to impurity. It's a unique case because the Torah made a special decree regarding food becoming receptive to tum'ah. Shneimar, because it says al kol zera zerua asher yizarea. It uses the language 3 times on any seeded seed which is planted, to include even that which is planted in a pot. Okay, so therefore Rabbi Shimon has an exclusion only for seeds and plants with regard to tum'ah. But in all other halachic areas, he would say that something planted in a pot is not considered attached to the ground, even if there's a hole in the bottom of the pot and it's touching the ground, it doesn't matter.
What about Shemitah?
For everything else, he would say it's detached. It's detached, everything else. He would say detached. So, a certain old elderly gentleman asked a question. Me Rabbi Zera from Rabbi Zera. Shoresh keneged nekev mali, Amar Rabbi Shimon. He said, what would Rabbi Shimon say in the following case? I have a potted plant. I just went to, Home Depot. They have in the back, I got a potted plant. It has a hole on the bottom of the pot. And the root of the plant is actually protruding from the bottom. Like sometimes the root will come out on the bottom. And I take that and I put it right on the ground. It's not rooted in the ground, but the root is touching the ground through the hole. It's right there. What would you say then? Ishtik velo amarle velo mideh. He didn't say a thing. Rabbi Zera didn't answer. He said, I want to know, what would Rabbi Shimon say? Is he still going to say it's detached, even though the root is exposed right over the ground? He didn't say anything. Zimna chada one time, ashkache diativ v'kamar. One time this elderly person came to a shi'ur that Rabbi Zera was giving, and Rabbi Zera said the following halacha. Umodeh Rabbi Shimon shem nikav bechdei tahorato. That Rabbi Shimon agrees that if the pot was broken to the level, to the extent that it's no longer mikabel tum'ah, the pot itself is not mikabel tum'ah, that when you put it on the ground, it's considered attached to the ground. So let me explain what that means. What it means is like this, that vessels are only receptive to tum'ah when they're intact. When they're intact. So this pot, when it has a hole in it of a certain size, let's say the size that an olive could go through it, would no longer be considered a container anymore because it's broken. Even if the hole is on the side of the pot, it doesn't matter.
Even if it's designed that way.
Right. Even if it's if it's designed that way, it might be different. But
that's how these pots are.
But yeah.
Designed.
But we're talking about a case where it's broken. So let's just make it simpler. Because if it's designed that way, then it's more complicated. Then you need kedei rimon for a pomegranate to go through. Whatever. So it's a different story. So once you come into design, you have different issues. But it's broken on the side. There's a hole on the side, and the hole on the side is the size that it would actually, that vessel, that pot, if a dead sheretz touched it, it wouldn't become tameh, because it's not considered a pot anymore. It's not because it's broken. At that point, let's say you have a plant. The bottom of the pot is intact, but on the side a hole is made in it that makes it considered a broken vessel. So for all other considerations, it's a broken vessel, and you put that on the ground, even Rabbi Shimon would say there's no vessel there, halachically, because it's broken, and because there's no vessel there, it's attached to the ground. So as luck would have it, the guy who asked him that original question about the root protruding was there, and he said, what is this nonsense? He said to him, Amar lehashta shoresh keneged nekev ba'e minach velo amrad li velo midi nikav b'chtei ta'orato mibaya. What are you, crazy? What kind of thing is this? A case that I asked you where there's a hole on the bottom of the pot and the root is coming right out. You told me that you're not sure. Maybe Rabbi Shimon would still say that it's not attached to the ground. But a hole on the side of the vessel, because in some abstract halachic sense, the vessel is not an intact vessel anymore, you're going to consider that attached to the ground now? Because in an abstract halachic world, that vessel is not a vessel anymore because it has a hole in the side? I mean, what kind of sense does that make? And I'm talking about a physical reality. The root is coming out of the bottom. So what would a typical rabbi would say? This is what we call a balabatish question. You know, what kind of question is this? You know, we don't take this question seriously, but it's a good question. So what happens? Amar Abaye ve'i itmar lahad Rabbi Zera hachihu itmar. He says to him, you know what? You're right. That's impossible that he would have said that. That would be contradictory. But what he did say was, Rabbi Shimon shim nikav lemata merevi'it, that if the vessel, true, you're right. If you have a basically functionally intact pot, and all it has is a hole on the side, the size of an olive, and basically it's otherwise fine, and you were to take that and put it on the ground, of course Rabbi Shimon is not going to say that that's attached to the ground. That would be absurd. How could he say that? But what he would say is, if the hole is so low on the pot that what's left on the bottom of the pot is a shard that wouldn't be able to contain a revi'it of water, that's the minimum amount for a shard to be considered significant. So if the hole is all the way toward the bottom, such that if you wanted to fill that pot with water, you couldn't fill a revi'it without it spilling out the side, there Rabbi Shimon is going to say that's not a vessel anymore. Okay, true, if it's on the side higher up, he'll still consider that a vessel for this purpose, for the purpose of saying that it's not attached to the ground. But if the hole is so low that if you actually filled that pot with water, it would be non-functional because it would come right out the side, you wouldn't be able to hold a revi'it of water in that bottom part of the pot, there Rabbi Shimon is going to say that's not considered a pot anymore, and therefore it's considered at one with the ground. So he still has the same issue, that there's somewhat of a disparity between saying that having a hole on the bottom of the pot with the root protruding is a question, but having a hole on the side is not a question and is definitely attached to the ground. But he makes it a little bit better by saying it's only a hole that's so low that bottom part of the pot wouldn't be functional at all anymore. It wouldn't even be able to hold water anymore. And that's why we're going to now consider it as if there's no pot there, and as if the plant is essentially attached to the ground. So the point here is, Rabbi Shimon is not looking at physical connection. He's looking at conceptual connection. Something that's in a pot is considered distinct from the ground, even if and something that is in a broken pot is considered attached to the ground. Because we're now looking at the physical connection, we're looking at the conceptual connection, and conceptually, once it's broken at a certain level, it's not considered there anymore, even though physically it is still there. And physically, it might look like it's there, even though conceptually sometimes...
But is that a valid halachic reasoning?
Sure. Sometimes the concept is more significant than especially in Tumah v'Torah, but in general, sometimes the concept is more powerful than the physical reality. So the physical reality, it might look physically like it's attached, but conceptually, from a halachic perspective, be detached, and vice versa.
But he's bringing a special new way of defining the concept for a broken pot.
Right.
Functional.
He's saying, right.
It won't work as a pot, not just that it's broken.
Right, it's so broken that even that bottom piece wouldn't be able to hold any water. That's an even further step, because he's saying, because the first way was saying that the pot as a whole is not functional anymore because it has a hole in the side. The second way is saying that bottom part that is actually the interposition between the dirt in the pot and the ground, itself is not functional anymore. Because it wouldn't even be able to hold water. And if that bottom part itself is not functional anymore, now we don't even have an interposition between the dirt and the ground anymore. That's why it's an even more powerful case. Because in the case where the hole is higher on the body of the pot, the bottom of the pot is still there and intact. And why are you saying that that's not attached? Why are you saying that that is that's all of a sudden is attached? But when the hole is on the bottom, such that the bottom of the pot wouldn't be functional anymore to even hold water, so there we're certainly going to say that shard on the bottom, which is not even functional as the bottom of a pot anymore, is not distinct from the ground upon which it rests. And then certainly kal v'chomer, it would seem, if there's a hole on the bottom of the pot that the root is protruding from, we would also say the bottom of the pot is not functional anymore, and it would be considered to be attached.
It's like in one.
Because that's the concept. There's a broken pot, and that's how we rule. Period.
Right. Well, he basically does.
No, he doesn't.
He's just saying that it has to be so broken that even the bottom of the pot. Right. A further definition. Yeah. Well, now we're going to see that there are actually multiple definitions, which is how the Gemara is going to end today, because now we're going to see Amar Rav Rava says chamesh midot b'klei cheres. There are actually 5 different levels that something can be broken. Okay. So nikav kimotzi mashke. Let's say you have a vessel that's broken to the point that water will drip out of it. So taor militame gistera, va'adain kaliu lekadesh bo mechatat. So what gistera means is that if you have a pot that breaks, okay, but the piece that's left of it could still hold water. That's called the gistera. You might use that. You might redesignate that piece to hold water. So if you redesignated a piece to hold water, so it was already a shard, basically, but it was a functional shard. And now it has a hole in it, so you're just going to throw it away. But if you had a pot that had a tiny hole in it that dripped a little bit, you still might use it. So that's why he says it could still be used to prepare the mechatat, to prepare the para aduma ashes with water, because you wouldn't throw away a pot just because it had a little hole in it, although you would throw away a shard that had a little hole in it, because that was already its second use, and now you're going to have to plug up a hole in something that was already a broken shard. That's too much. Okay, now we say, nikav ke kones mashke. If the hole was big enough, not only that water seeped out, but that water goes in, which is a slightly bigger hole, so then taor milakadesh bo mechatat. So now even a pot would be no longer considered a pot anymore. It could no longer be used to make the water of the para aduma. Va'adayin kli ulachshir bo zra'im. But it would still be considered a kli. It would still be considered that if you planted seeds in that pot, they were not attached to the ground. Okay, so because since it has a hole that's only enough that liquid could penetrate in, so that's significant enough of a hole to say that this is not an intact vessel, that we can't use it for preparing mechatat, we can't use it for preparing the ashes of the para aduma, mixing it with water. But it's not a big enough hole to say that if it's resting on the ground, it's attached to the ground. We're not going to say that. Nikav keshoresh katan taor milach shir bo zra'im. But once you have a hole big enough in the pot that a root of a plant could penetrate through, now we're going to say that if it rests on the ground, it's considered attached to the ground. That's the atzitz nakuv. That is the pot with a hole in it. The hole has to be large enough that a root could penetrate through. Vadayin kaliu lekabel bo zetim. But still, this vessel could be used for holding solid foods. So we would still say that it's a vessel that could become tameh. On its own could become tameh. Okay, so it can't be used for preparing the mechatat. It would be considered attached to the ground if it were sitting on the ground. But it wouldn't be considered impervious to tum'ah if something tameh touched it. However, nikav kemotze zetim tahor milakabel bo zetim. Once you have a hole in it that's large enough for an olive to pass through, so now it's not considered a vessel at all. Va'adayin kiliu lekabel bo rimonim. But you might, Rashi explains it, you might say, you know what? So I won't use it for regular food, I'll use it for large pieces of food that won't fall through the hole. So if you reassign it, so stam, if a person didn't reassign it, we would consider that a broken vessel unusable. But if the person said, you know what, I'm going to use it, but for large pieces of food, so then you would say that now, nikav kemotzi rimonim taor miklum. That then and only then would you say that the size, as if a rimon, if a pomegranate could pass through, now nobody's going to use that anymore. Nobody's going to use that anymore. So now it's completely impervious to tum'ah because it's not a vessel anymore. V'im hukaf tzamid patil ad shifachit rubo. And if there's a covering on top, so let's say you had a bowl that's made of earthenware. Earthenware can only become tameh from its airspace inside. It has a hole on the side the size of a pomegranate, but its top is covered. And inside this thing is some bread. This bowl is in the house, that there's a dead body in the house, in the room, under the same roof. Now normally anything in the airspace of this kli cheres would become tameh, because it's under the same roof as the dead body. But since you covered over the top and sealed the covering, it's tzamid patil, so therefore it cannot make the loaf of bread inside tameh. Because even though there's a hole on the side, the size of a pomegranate, the tum'ah, so to speak, can't go through that way. It can only go through the top of the vessel. And since the top of the vessel is sealed, it still protects what's inside, even though there's a hole the size of a pomegranate on the side. However, if a majority of the bowl is broken, is open now, even with a cover on top, we're not going to consider that it's like having a roof of a sukkah with no walls, right? The covering is not going to protect what's inside from tumah once the majority is broken in. So this shows you the different gradations of holes in vessels. So
can I just raise
sure.
a difficulty just with the premise of the whole conversation is that they're talking about the usefulness with regard to tumah or not tumah. They're talking about the usefulness of the pot when it's actually being used as a flower pot or to plant something.
Well, this is a different statement. No, because now Rava is talking about a totally different issue. Because now Rava is just talking in general about pots in general, not about flower pots in particular.
Okay, but in general, so why aren't they considering the fact that a pot with any hole can serve as a container to plant something? It's always, even if it has 3 holes that are big enough to...
It would be considered... Oh, you mean why is that not considered a functional use for... Let's say you mean like a pomegranate could pass through it, but you could use it as a flower pot.
A flower pot, right, exactly. To put the dirt, pack the dirt and plant something.
It's a good question. I'm not sure why they don't bring that into the calculation. It's a good question. Yeah. Right. I guess that we're talking about secondary versus primary.
It's not secondary.
Right. I suppose if it were a pot made for that purpose, then it might be a different story. That might be a different story. You're right. Now just one last point, and we're going to end here. So Amar Ravasi said, Shamati kli cheres shiuro kemotze rimon. I heard that a kli cheres, that an earthenware item, is the measurement of it is kemotzi rimon. That when does it become considered no longer a vessel, no longer viable? When a pomegranate can pass through. Amar le Rava said to him, Shema lo shamata el b'mukaf tzamid patil. You must have been talking about a case where it's covered on top. So what is he talking about? What do you mean? Rava just told us that even if it has a hole the size of a pomegranate on the side, if the top is covered, it's still good. It still protects the contents, unless the majority is broken. So why is he saying to Rav Asi, this pomegranate hole on the side, if it's covered on top, it would still be mikabel tumah? Why is he saying that? It's not true. He holds that the majority has to be broken for that to be true. La kashe, no problem. Ha b'rav Ravi, ha b'zutre. It depends. One is talking about a large vessel. Rashi interprets it as follows: that a large vessel, the majority of it, in other words, would have to be broken for it to be mikabel tum'ah, for it to be considered a broken vessel. In other words, the majority would have to be broken for it to be considered broken, for such that the top, in other words, we're talking again about an earthenware vessel that has the top sealed. So if the majority of it is broken, a pomegranate-sized hole on the side wouldn't be enough. Only when the majority is broken is it considered breached, basically, completely breached. And now the covering on the top won't help it anymore. But a small vessel, even if the majority is breached, won't be considered broken unless it's at least the size of a pomegranate. So he takes the leniency on both sides. Rashi takes the leniency on both sides in interpreting the halacha of Rava. That if it's a large vessel, only when the majority is broken does the seal on top stop protecting the contents inside. If it's a small vessel, even if the majority is broken, unless the whole is the size of a pomegranate, because you could imagine a vessel so small that the majority could be broken, but it wouldn't be the size of a pomegranate, the whole. So still, the seal on top would protect. That's how Rashi interprets it. However, Tosafot does not like this and reverses it and interprets it the opposite way. That in a large vessel, the size of a pomegranate breaches the side. And in a small vessel, even if the hole is less than a pomegranate, if it's the majority of the vessel, then the vessel is kaput, as we say in Spanish. And therefore would no longer be considered functional. So the point here is that we have different gradations in the brokenness of a vessel. We're going to see a little bit more of the discussion of this tomorrow. The relevance, of course, to our sugya is understanding what type of a hole constitutes a hole for a pot to be considered attached to the ground if it were to be placed on the ground with a plant inside of it. Have a great day.